Companies operating in today's global economy really need to get an understanding of the international geopolitical risk landscape. At Infortal Worldwide, we work with our clients on solving risk before it starts. Welcome to the Riskology podcast, where we're looking at managing business risk globally and really understanding the geopolitical risk landscape.
Welcome, everyone, to the latest episode of Riskology by Infortal. And we're excited today because we have a guest joining us, Tom Hanson, who is the CEO and founder of Channel Architect LLC, which we'll hear more about in just a minute. But Tom has spent a number of years with the U.S. Foreign Commercial Service, which, he's had some really great postings stretching all the way from Bucharest to Calgary, New Orleans, São Paulo, hopefully the winters in São Paulo and the summers in Calgary. But Tom, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Chris, so much for having me. I'm so impressed with the work that Infortal is doing in the world, and it's a pleasure to discuss how the day-to-day strategies of leading channel partnerships intersect with your expertise as well. As you mentioned, I have the luxury of having been both a diplomat for the United States in the area of commercial service, the postings that you mentioned, as well as a lot of years in the private sector. So I've been able to come back into the private sector now after spending many years overseas representing the U.S. companies to focus on how a company, by the way, not just an American company anymore because I'm not, serving the government, I can assist companies from any country who seek entry into another country. And of course, being in California, which is one of the world's largest economies, inevitably the companies with whom I work, whether based here in the state or outside the United States, are seeking ways in which they can enter the United States market, not only to be near to their suppliers, but also to their customers. So I've enjoyed being able to assist with everything from helping Eastern European-based designer of high voltage power grids to assess how to enter the US and Canada on the heels of the announcement that every single community in the United States and Canada seems to want to build a data center. And along with that's going to come the need for trusted and secure forms of energy, to a California-based grower of food commodity who needs some assistance with deciding whether or not Brazil will be a good market for them. So I'm able to shift a lot of gears based upon what I know and who I've been able to work with over the years. I've developed a stable of trusted colleagues and network partners in the countries in which I've served and others. So it's a really wonderful mix of strategic and tactical leadership of how a company runs a channel for distributing their goods and services.
Yeah, I love framing it in terms of looking at that channel of distribution, channel of services. It's a good way to sort of think about international commerce. And, one of the things that we've highlighted on this podcast is really once you start looking at international business, which, let's be honest, most domestic business has international components these days. You really need a guide to make sure that, one, you know who you're dealing with, what you're getting involved with, but also making sure that you're taking advantage of any benefits that might be out there. And I'm sure we'll hit on some of those today, based on some of your experience abroad before. But to kick it off, I thought we would jump into some international relations, which are essentially right here on our doorstep. As the Trump administration came into power, I don't think anyone was expecting the emphasis on the focus anyway on Mexico and Canada right off the bat, where there was tariffs presented. They were eased, I think, right away. But really, it just shows you that U.S.-Mexico-Canada relations are on the table for negotiation. And we currently have agreements in place. And I know that's something that you've looked at closely in terms of the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement. But interested to getting your take just overall on how that relationship works, but really sort of how you're looking at it now that Trump is sort of moving forward.
Well, one of the things I tell prospective exporters in any of the three North American countries is look across the back fence. If you're going to try and find even an extra 10% in global revenue, why not try to find it in the friendliest nations, the closest nations, those borders? We're sharing fences with these two countries. So it's only logical in a way that the new administration, both now and in their first go-round, would look at the relationships that we have with our partners, who happen to be our largest trading partners too. And boy, what an enviable position that North America has. We can present ourselves as a trading bloc around the world to stand up against the European Union and against China. So we should really do all we can to fine tune and strengthen the trade agreement, the trilateral agreement we have. So in a way, it's logical that the administration is looking first in our backyards and saying, how can we make this better for America first and North America second? There are some issues with respect to how you negotiate with your neighbors, what constitutes a healthy relationship. But again, when the USMCA came into being, NAFTA version 2 in the first Trump administration, there was immediately put into place some side doors for renegotiation. And so starting in 2026, we'll see that start to happen. So the three countries are gearing up for that, apart from the fact that they're dealing with these sudden, let's just say these sudden onslaughts that have come out of Washington. These are things being lobbed over the fence, to continue the analogy, to see how they land. But what I'm really interested to see is next year, when the three countries sit down again, we don't know who the Canadian administration will be at the time. We have some ideas on who will take Justin Trudeau's place, but we have this really solid administration in Mexico now. The new president is a protege of former President Obrador. But the interesting news for Mexico is that there are some people who are going to be at the table representing Mexico's interests who are quite good negotiators, as we would expect. So I think that it won't be a pushover for our trading partners, but the Trump administration has certainly come in hard with, as I said, some preemptive volleys. And it's a little bit unnerving to see, if you're a U.S. company, to see your suppliers in Canada or in Mexico being kind of in the front line with what's happening between the trilateral government negotiations. And here's where we kind of start to settle in on the themes of what it means to be resilient and what it means to be adaptable if you are a company with a well-established channel partnership whose members may be in countries that are subject to these upcoming tariffs. So it's a watch and see, certainly.
That's true. I think that's important to remember, given the proximity of the three countries we're discussing here. At the end of the day, the companies that are operating across these borders and through these shifting political dynamics still have to find a path forward. And so that comes down to sort of what makes economic sense. And, right now, with all of the big talk, especially with tariffs, and if you think about a 25% tariff across the board, that would just be crippling for, I think, all three economies, to be quite honest. So how real is that as a threat? It's hard to tell. It does feel a bit like bluster. It does kind of fall into a certain type of negotiating tactic, as we've seen. But I think what we can probably expect is there will be some sort of rebalancing of the tariff systems that are in place. And so if you're a company, particularly in the auto space, I know they're on top of it. That's something that you're going to have to currently closely monitor and make sure that you're exploring all of those options within that. And again, thinking through the example of looking at this through a channel, maybe you need to examine how your process flows through these jurisdictions. And, I think it's going to be really interesting to see, as you mentioned, the negotiations move forward, because we really do have a new cast of characters, even though Trump's getting a lot of the attention. We've got a new president in Mexico who's very ambitious and I think is taking things very seriously in terms of looking at some of the other issues with the cartel and with sort of like the drug trade and migration. I think that's all going to feed into these discussions. So it's going to be, I think, a lot to cover in the coming year. And then with Canada, as you mentioned, we're probably going to see some elections soon there. And so what happens in this next sort of few months could have a huge impact, I think, for 5 and 10 years. And so those companies that are really sort of aligning themselves for that new landscape, the sooner you do that, I think the better position you'll be in.
Indeed. And one thing I'm noticing, Chris, is, to their credit, some of the Canadian provinces, and I think some of the Mexican states as well, are engaging preemptively in subnational diplomacy in a good way. And, the positive aspects of subnational diplomacy mean that, for instance, the province of Alberta can send its premier down to address the Western Governors Association, which in fact she did, basically saying, look, folks, let's be realistic. I think we need to ensure that the U.S. government sets aside considerations to ensure the uninterrupted flow of energy from our province to the greater United States. So that's an example, I think, of what's happening in the eastern part of Canada and in Michigan. You mentioned the auto sector earlier, Chris.
Yeah.
You're also seeing, I think, the province of Ontario doing an absolute charm offensive in the United States, even to the point of U.S. media advertising in recent broadcasts about how, regardless, we're a tried and true partner. And by the way, if the automobile supply chain is interrupted in any way between the three countries, we're in a world of hurt. And back to your earlier point about how a 25% across the board tariff would be egregious. Yes, it would. If you look at individual sectors and across the whole economy, I think the first Trump administration, when they went after the Canada steel and aluminum, they were very pointedly saying this is about stopping the transshipment of goods that are originating in China. And I think they're at that again. But it's unfortunate as a business person to see the vast majority of Canadian and Mexican companies caught in the line of fire between what's happening on a federal level. And it creates this atmosphere of fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And that's when you have to just dig your heels in and trust that you have, in fact, built a very sound channel partnership with companies in those countries. You've got to be resilient. You've got to adapt if you need to somehow to keep that channel partnership strong, because that will very likely weather any presidential administration in this revolving door of three administrations that we have in our nations.
I think that's so important to recognize. The economic forces at play do have a significant impact in terms of where the policy ends up. And I think one of the downsides of moving so quickly and trying to attack so many policy positions all at once is the fact that you tend to hit things in sort of a broad stroke manner. And so there's a lot of unintended consequences, which at the moment, I think it's really going to be up to a lot of companies and a lot of the private sector actors, or maybe even local government, as you mentioned, to sort of point out the intricacies of how these policy positions can really have a negative or unintended consequence. And I think in this situation, when you think of North America, watching the automakers will give you those first indicators, because they've already been vocal about those tariffs, as you mentioned. And if you look at it, the lobbying efforts that they're able to deploy in Washington, D.C. is not something to shy away from. They definitely have significant hold over both houses. So I think it'll be interesting to see, as those negotiations play out, how does the private sector sort of influence that going forward? Still, with the new administration, your guess is as good as mine, but I think it will be interesting to see how North American negotiations go.
Yeah, an image just came to my mind, and that's in a rugby test. You've got this amazing scrum where by brute force and sheer will, you push the ball in the way you want it. And I think in that case, that scrum is represented by industry, Canadian, American, and Mexican industry, that is going to prove to the governments that it's going to say, we're bigger than, we have a longer incentive. And look at the technologies we're developing to make our businesses smarter. Look how we're moving goods smarter through the blockchain technology. That's, something that is a topic for, a whole different session. But there's so many administrative and technology ways to prove that the business machine is fluid and it's resilient and it's in control of the local and the national economy. So let's just see if the forward momentum and optimism of businesses in this free market of ours will counter any negotiations that seem to be going south.
Yeah, I think important to watch. I want to switch gears here, or switch locations, because I know you spent some time in Bucharest in Europe, and Europe, of course, is hitting the headlines at the moment. The negotiations in Europe, of course, are focused on the conflict that we've seen between Russia and the Ukraine. And really, Europe has been shaken to their core in a lot of different ways. But I think the relationships that Europe has had with the U.S. in the past are sort of up for negotiation as well. Do you have a sense, maybe from former colleagues or just your experience there, in terms of what Europe can do to kind of not right the ship, but maybe sort of get back into a better sort of channel of communication and trade with the U.S.?
I think a lot about the structure and the integrity of the European Union itself. What does it mean for the European Union to be what it is? What does it mean for these various countries and partner countries of the EU to function and to advance? And there's a lot of pessimistic coverage in the media about how, in fact, economic advancement and year-over-year growth for the greater EU economy is nowhere near what people had hoped it would be. And the other thing we're kind of seeing is this unraveling of solidarity. You probably read the news this week about these gatherings in Paris and last week's Munich Security Conference, where there were gatherings of leaders from within the EU and with guest appearances by the US government, where it was evident that there's no consensus on the will or the ability for the European Union to take the alpha position in protecting Ukraine. When I was working in Bucharest and when Russia invaded Ukraine, it's been now 3 years, as we know, everything changed as far as the pivot for NATO and the pivot for American military presence moving into Poland and Romania because, of course, of the border position with Ukraine. So I think what we're seeing, Chris, is a bit of a test, and there's some blinking going on when it comes down to whether the European Union can stand in solidarity and say, okay, we get it. We hear the position of the United States current administration. We will, or we can't, step up and protect the interests of our eastern border and the integrity of our economy. So in summary, I'd say it's a sense of uncertainty and a bit of wavering in the solidarity of EU countries. And it's pointing to a possible lack, whether real or perceived, in their ability to grow an economy and devote enough resources to defense that they initiate versus which they respond to the United States in having to do that. So a couple of observations basically on the state of play amongst the EU nations that causes concern.
Yeah, I think that's great insight. The overall outlook, you think 20 years ago, 25 years ago, the EU and the development of EU policy was all of the talk in terms of, if you look at the ideals behind all of that. But now we're at this point where things have matured, and this really is that point in time where they've got to either galvanize, pull it together, and this could be a moment of truth, moment of strength to push the EU forward, or the other side of the coin is it could sort of fragment to a certain degree. We did see the Brexit situation recently. It is possible that we could see some more of those types of tensions, but either way, I think this will be the critical moment for the EU. So again, going back to what we were discussing before, it's easy to get distracted by the politics, but there's a lot of commerce and there's a lot of economics at play as well that can influence everything that we're describing. So it's not just war games, but also the economic factors that can influence what we just sort of talked through.
Indeed. And we're looking at, along with this terrible invasion and the resulting loss of life and ruination of the infrastructure of Ukraine, the United States government and all the EU governments and probably Korea and China and everyone else are saying, okay, how do we look ahead for reconstruction? It must already begin by nature, even though bombs are still being lobbed. We must start to think about reconstruction because of what Ukraine's economy means to the world as far as agriculture and energy. And oh, by the way, critical minerals are now on the table. And so then it comes down to us saying, okay, what do we present as an opportunity? It sounds morbid, but what will it mean for America's businesses and the EU businesses everywhere to play a part in making the Ukraine, building it back better in many ways? So there's an issue of the strength of a company's presence in Europe, its partnership networks, and its ability to respond, to pivot. 5 years ago, when COVID hit our world, we all learned how to pivot in many ways, personal and professional. So that's kind of what we're facing now. So it's a matter of looking down the road 5, 10, and 20 years. And it comes back to what it'll mean to have a solid EU structure.
Yeah.
How we will relate to the EU, given whoever our administrations might be in the coming 20 years.
Yeah, I couldn't think of a better theme for us to end on. And those businesses that are resilient and able to weather through the storm really can find new opportunities that come out from even unfortunate situations. But that brings us to the end of our time for today. Tom, we'll have to have you back once some of these negotiations and transatlantic relations move forward and regroup and see what we're actually dealing with.
It would be my pleasure, Chris.
All right. Great to have you, Tom.
All right. Take care.